Hey there, everybody. So I wanted to make a relatively quick video on some of the observations that I have been making over the entire season and some of the changes that I think that are really integral for us as League of Legends viewers to understand as Worlds is coming up, because this is going to happen quite often, and if we are able to track it, then it will not only make it more enjoyable but for more educational as well. So the end game situations are what I would define as a specific event or a specific phase in the game that is later on where it has relatively been quote unquote solved out to the point where unless the one that is ahead does not make a mistake, then you are able to securely close out the game given the circumstances that you're in. So there are multiple endgame situations in any game, and League of Legends is no exception. The one that I want to talk about today was specifically the Dragon's Soul point. There is multiple reasons why I picked this one as my first topic. One is that it is the simplest, and second is that it also has very overlapping themes with the Elder Dragon take, which is set up and the execution is typically identical. And this is additionally important, mainly because it is probably the one that got changed the most out of the recent patches, so I thought it was worthy of a decent update. Let's look at the pros and cons before we get into the really nitty gritty parts of it, though. Pros, obviously, is that it lasts forever. Dragon Soul will not expire, and in a lot of ways, it is an instant payout that doesn't necessarily require any executions afterwards. It is you don't need to do specific things to optimize Dragon in a way that you require for like Baron sieges, for example, and it just gives you a permanent buff for the remainder of the game. Second is that it enables and fixes certain computational features. These are some of the lists and some of the examples that I could come off right off of the bat. Infernal is just good on average. Everybody could technically use it. It sometimes delays getting outscaled for minutes on end. Even if you have champions that don't necessarily do well, for example, champions like Ari, champions like Callista, Draven, the ones who don't particularly do well in later and front to back team fights, could go even against likes of Zeri, Sivir, even Azir in mid lane if they have Infernal Soul. Another one is Mountain. It's a little bit more situational, but it is still very strong. It could be very powerful against dive compositions or poke compositions that only have limited windows of execution. The ones that have to take that one moment to ruin your game plan, and Mountain makes it very difficult for them to accomplish that. Ocean is good on average. In my opinion, it is the least effective because it is the only one that actually has a direct answer, it being Keel Cut. However, it increases your HE sustain, which means that it increases your margin of error for the long term. Don't really have a lot of time to discuss this in detail, but that's what it basically does. Wind or Cloud is situational, but it is still very strong. It has personally been my recent favorite because it provides windows of engage or disengage that is unavailable to your team comp before. If you typically had a hard time disengaging from a certain composition, best example is Zarya recently because of the way that her ultimate works. Zarya is able to escape out of a lot of dives and a lot of flanks if the champion has Cloud Soul. Vice versa, if you really need to catch that champion, then sometimes like a Cloud Soul on Wukong is exactly what you need to do that. Lastly, it's less dangerous to take than Baron. Even in later stages, Dragon deals less damage than Baron. Typically in Baron 5v5 situations, it'll be 6v5 because Baron deals that much damage, and a lot of people are required to stay within Baron. You cannot have a carry tank a Baron without facing severe consequences. Typically, you don't have to worry about those things when you're setting up for Dragon, even when the damage of the Dragon increases because you have 3 stacks. The cons of the Dragon Soul point is that it takes a lot of time to set up. It requires at least 15 minutes with the nature of the way that the dragon spawns. And then lastly, is that while you do get that major buff, you are adding a variability into the game by allowing Elder Dragon to spawn. But this is hardly a problem, mainly because the soul that you acquire is so powerful to the point that it typically puts you in an insane map state advantage that you will typically be able to get Elder Dragon as well. Let's take a look at the champions and the compositions that typically pursue this endgame. And we're going to try to link it with the soul conversation that we had a little bit earlier, so I'm not wasting you guys' time. Typically, strong VOD 2v2s early, especially, that let them stack dragons early are very favored to do dragon stacking with endgame compositions. Kalista Draven are the ones that are most known. They typically deny the enemy's opportunities to play in the lane phase out. So, what that lets them do is it gives them the exact point in time that they need to stack dragons 5, even 6, 7 minutes earlier. And this will give them opportunities to start looking for the win condition around 30 minutes into the game, not instead of 35, 40, so on. And ones that are really good at 5v5 team fighting are also ones that who excel very well at Drake stacking. With the nature of Drake stacking and not requiring that much setup because of the nature, because of it dealing far less damage than Baron, so the front line could be wherever they want in theory, then it actually allows for a lot more freedom when it comes to 5v5. So there are actually a lot of compositions that can dragon stack very well. As a result, it being one of the most accessible endgame situations and circumstances. Front to back is the easiest to execute. You don't particularly need first setup, which we're going to talk about it in detail a little bit later. And the comps that we'll typically see are the orange comps, ones with a really strong tank or like a really beefy front line in the back that are defending the backline members that have high damage but having the same vulnerability. Flank requires one or two champions to exploit the squishier, higher profile champions in the other team. It benefits from first setup, but it doesn't necessarily need it. It's quite difficult without it, but it can be done. Poke requires coordinated identification of poke windows, and it is very difficult to execute without first setup. I've seen cases of being done, but it is out of the three that we have discussed, poke is the one that requires it the most. And it is also worth noting that Soul Point and Fourth Dragons in the Soul Third Dragon and Fourth Dragon sequence is nigh identical with slight differences in emphasis. So you could do this endgame maneuver by the time they have second dragon, while it will be less effective and it will give the enemy a less urgency in order to respond to what you're doing. It could still be done. And I've talked enough with a notepad, so let's get a little bit more into the fun stuff by looking at the Rift Kit. So there are two forms of dragon preparation that has been rather active in the past few years. And one is taught to me by a colleague, and another one's the one that I've been familiarizing myself for years. And so I'll talk about the one that I've been very familiar for years first. It's the one that Korean teams do very well in. It is basically the goal of the setup is this. The first goal is to remove sideline cross map options or inhibit it to maximize time investment on from the other team. The other is to create a favorable window of initiation in the mid lane before the dragon spawns. And third is to create a favorable area of battle when the dragon spawns. These three goals are the overarching goals of the LCK setup. And it revolves, and all these keywords are going to come back, so we're going to pretend that we're the red side for now. Assume that all these towers are gone for the sake of this simulation, because that is typically what happens at this stage of the game. And then let's see what could potentially happen in these simulated scenarios. Let's say that in this situation that the maps are plus equals for the sake of it being fair, because if it is plus or plus, plus plus or minus minus or minus plus, then things get typically complicated. And we are, of course, talking about theoretics at this point. And the ideal situation is that a minute before the dragon spawns, the top wave is either equals or plus. And this can be done in multiple ways. Some of the teams in LCK historically have pursued a 1-4-0 deviant, where there is one player from the team that is slow pushing the top wave and eliminating the one wave that from the enemy to make sure that the wave is either stuck here or even a plus here. Remember that in this situation, if the wave is situated somewhere around here, around the 20 to 25-minute mark, the wave will get stuck there and it will remain at equals for a really extended period of time. But if it goes past this point, that it will be a plus and it will push into their side and they'll have to respond to it. Otherwise, they'll lose major sources of farm. With that being said, let's say that that has indeed been accomplished. Then what would typically happen is that this top and the mid lane that would typically gain advantages off of this because they have four people that are defending it. Then after getting pushed, then they'll link up with the side laner that has been in, and then they'll be controlling the mid lane around on the minute to 30 seconds before the dragon spawns. That on that mid wave, these 5 champions will try to fight whoever's trying to control this wave. And this is the initial point in time where they will be able to get that little advantage if there's that one champion that is dealing with this wave right here. So in some ways, getting that plus is additionally important for this initiation window, because if they are not necessarily excelling a front-to-back team fight and this tower is still alive, then they will actually have a hard time doing the next part. Because let's still say that this part is equals. Then in this case, what they would typically do in here is the 0 to after they get this control, then until 0 to 30 to the dragon spawns in and of itself, then they could either spend their entire time in river, or if their sideline has a little bit of time because of the control that they have bought, then they could quickly erase this wave, make this into a positive, and then reclaim river once again, and then contest this 30 to 0 wave that is coming in order to get the full control. And this is the basic procedure that the Korean teams typically do in order to make sure that they do have that first setup. And again, while first setup is not necessarily required, it does give you a strong advantage, which we will examine a little bit further later on. Now, the LPL setup, which I don't particularly claim to be an expert of as of yet, but that I understand in this case is still more around the lines, instead of removing the cross map option, but forcing the enemy to be really here. Because in the LCK format, we are completely fine with the lane being stuck here in an equals. Then in an equal situation, this person does not need to go here. He could just stay here, answer the 5v5, and in a case where the red team doesn't excel at a 5v5 front-to-back situation, then they may be putting themselves into trouble because they cannot effectively push them away. And so in that case, what the LPL teams do is, in order to make sure that they get this wave in, they will send 3 people to trail this small wave that is going until this wave has been cleared and it becomes a plus. And they will do this they will spend additional time to make sure that this occurs. And this will typically allow them to create that plus on top side until a minute to even 30 seconds before the dragon spawns. So during the time that this happens, and then they're able to finally link up, chances under the assumption that the AD carry has to play all the way back because these guys, they cannot win control over the mid lane with only one person. Then after the wave has been cleared and this one person has to answer, then this is the point that they attack. During the 0 to 30 wave, 30-second wave, then having secured the man advantage, then they push away the enemy team and then run into dragon immediately. And then they get the dragon as a result. Now, there has been recent complications with this method because of the change that happened in 12.14, where the dragon is now significantly tankier. So unless your composition is built for murdering neutral objectives, this one person typically has time to clear this minus that is on their side, make it into an equals, and then join for this fight. And although they won't be getting first entry, they will not be getting the guaranteed man advantage that you will typically be acquiring and bursting. So by the time that this person is done and it is here, the dragon is already gone. That typically doesn't happen. So then in that case, where the things have been complicated enough to that point, then we have to identify these things. what now the fight is more important than ever before. So then there are certain conversations that must be had in order to emphasize this. So what are the things that we need to talk about? First is whether or not the competition will require for entry. We covered that before. And then how specifically those fights are supposed to pilot. And for the sake of simulations, then I have these drafts figured out. So this is a typical front to back scenario. You have a very strong two front lines that are going to be disabling and then preventing the back line from getting hit as long as possible, while these guys are just going to be raining fire. It could be Sivir, it could be Zeri, like it could be whatever. Let's say Zeri. That's like the most ideal front to back composition I can think of right now. Then the enemy will be coming in after we getting first entry. Ornn and Trundle will be preventing these guys from getting damaged, and then the window that they have these guys have created will be used by these guys, and then they will just slowly wipe them out and now sustain them. Very simple way to fight. Now, things get a little bit more complicated when you're looking at other situations. While the ceiling of execution is higher, it is nonetheless very effective. So the one that we'll look at first is flanks, because it is the second most complex. It revolves around, after getting first setup, how you're going to use it, and especially when you are going to turn. And because there are two places of the worthy of flanking that are provided to you once you get first setup. One is this dragon wall like this, and one is this blue wall. Champions can hop over and then control, like, flank them around this area, and then they could also go around this wall and then flank you around this area. Now, this is worth noting that as a result, typically the turning point for flank compositions, it's this pixel brush. They'll pink it, they'll look at the way that they're approaching. The moment that the pink word gets attacked, that is the point of trigger of execution, and then these guys will start pinching it. And hopefully the distraction is enough to the point that the backline members of their team will be able to clean them out after the flank has been successfully been done. Now, the far difficult one, the one that you typically don't see a lot right now because of the champions that are in the meta, is the poke type of composition. Ones that will try to slow down your entry as much as possible after getting first setup, and making you so weak by the time that the dragon is up to the point that you would not want to fight them anymore. So then typically, like, there's two opportunities where it can be attacked. First is this, once they enter the first time here into this bush, then Zoe, Jace, can all focus their fire onto this one specific point. And then once they enter that past that point, then you have to back away. Then Zoe and the Jace reposition like this, and then the Karma and the Trundle are able to just hold them at bay, and then they do a second area around the barrage. And then by the time that those two barrages have been successful, then the enemy team should be low enough to the point that they're not willing to contest. And these are the fight situations that are going to happen. And the key point in this case is, again, identifying that point of execution. It becomes increasingly more strict as we go down the line of these type of compositions. However, all of them are theoretically basically the same. Hopefully the thing that you learn the most in this is this format right here, because it is most likely the one that is discussed the least. But my plan is to get this preliminary thing out right now, and then embellish it further through examples that I see in playoffs and in worlds. So by the end of 2022 season, then we will have a comprehensive thing that I will be using this video as a bare bones to create a better comprehensive guide in both video format and also in writing. So stay tuned for that, and always thank you for watching.